I'm not going to read too much more, but Nora also has a really fantastic exhibition on right now in Dubai, the Phantom Limb, um, which she is going to discuss with us. And also, she has curated an exhibition as part of Homeworks in Beirut. I will rise, I will be millions. So these are two projects that she will focus on, and looking forward. Thank you, Nora.
Hi, hi everybody. Thank you so much for the invitation. And I'm very sorry I can't be with you in person today, but I'm very happy that I can participate virtually. Let me know if you can hear me okay before I start. Okay, great. Um, so as Natasha mentioned, I'm going to be talking through an exhibition that we currently have on at the Jameel Art Center here, called Phantom Limb. And I want to also give you a brief introduction to the art center as well. So I don't know if you can please start pulling up the slides. So I opened 1 year ago, almost a year. I wanted to give a brief introduction on who we are and what we do to contextualize things a little bit. Um, so on the second slide, there's an image of the art center, and we're the first independent nonprofit art center in Dubai. We opened last year on November 11th, and we're a collecting institution. We also host exhibitions, commissions. We have the first dedicated library for the arts in the UAE. And our collection focuses mostly on the Middle East, South Asia, and Southeast Asia, but a global in scope. So we're kind of a new space. Um, and within that, Random Limb is actually the kind of third main exhibition we put on it. So I'm very happy to be able to talk about it today. Um, just a little introduction on the kind of thinking behind the exhibition. So, the kind of institution also works a lot in heritage conservation and preservation. And so we were really trying to think critically about what it is that we do and why we do it. And Art Jamil is the kind of parent organization of the Jamil Art Center. So the original impetus for the institution came from a kind of institutional desire to rethink kind of some of our core activities. But as I thought more about it, if you move on to the next slide, it was really during a time which is still ongoing, where the kind of debate on restitution was very active, particularly in Europe, in European Union. Uh, there was a report that just started that had come out in France, and at the same time, particularly in the region around us, we really felt that there was distinct kind of weaponization of heritage, if you will. So if you think about Palestine and the history of how the discipline of archaeology has been used to legitimize territorial occupation and continues to be used as a way to kind of claim land within Jerusalem itself and otherwise, this was a very raw reality that we felt was important to do. At the same time, over the last 10 years, you saw a rapid destruction of a lot of artifacts across Iraq, across Syria, kind of entered the global imagination, but in a way that was kind of premised on producing digital reproduction of these objects in a more spectacular way than really thinking about what's behind these objects are extracted or can I just check you can hear me okay? Mm, sure. Uh, I'll turn my video off, and then if you could put your video on, then I can see what's on the screen. Okay. Uh, right. So I was talking about kind of weaponization of heritage objects. but how they were entering the kind of global imagination in these kind of replicas, 3D replicas, and thinking about how the digital kind of state heritage, but completely sort of eliding the communities that existed in and around these objects. And so I started thinking about, how can we produce a kind of archaeology in reverse? And that is, think about historically these objects that have been extracted, the kind of codes of museum display and the ascription of value, and not so much think about knowledge that is from the object, but rather think about the network that enables the object to be extracted in the first place, that enables for exhibition and museum in the first place. So to really kind of think about all these networks of hands and administration and logistics that enable these objects to move. And at the same time, to try and think about the kind of work that's left when these objects are extracted and the kind of the emptiness, if you will, and how communities and artists kind of responded to the writing of history when the object no longer exists. So trying to think of how we can make the object speak when it's no longer. So if you can move, I'll give you a kind of exhibition tour. And if you go to the slide after this, so this is the text. If you can move on to the next slide. So here you have the first room of the show. And you have in front of you by Theo Mercier, and to the right is a work by Claire Battery. On the left, Benji Boyadjian. So I'll talk through each one by one. If you can go to the next slide. Here's another view of the same space. And on the slide after that, you'll see the work of Benji Boyadjian, who is an artist based in Jerusalem and has been, for the last 10 years, collecting objects from the side of the Wadi Shami, or as Israelis call it, the Valley of Godrej, which is located on the kind of periphery of Jerusalem and is slated for settlement in the near future. So he's been collecting sort of found objects, like traces of everyday household items, Ottoman pottery, pieces of agriculture, pieces of trees, rubber bullets, shrapnel. Within these, he puts these in kind of cabinet curiosities. So if you go to the next slide, you can. And he plays this kind of processes along the space. So in the cabinet of curiosities, you're kind of, to look to open the doors, to look and see what's there. It's essentially kind of this mishmash, or what he calls the kind of ground archaeology of this space. He elevates this kind of everyday object, or essentially sort of detritus, into the space, into the kind of value space of the museum. And it begins to tell a story of the space. It begins to tell a kind of history of the experience in the space. And also act as a kind of archive of a space that's essentially is disappearing. So this is just a kind of smaller cabinet that he's used for the show, while in other iterations he has a kind of much bigger cabinet. But in a kind of echo of the same, thinking about his work actually arrived at the opening. If you go down to the next slide. So it's always an issue getting artworks out of Palestine, and his work was held for many weeks at customs in the UK, in fact, because it had put pieces of shrapnel probably in like that. So it was the kind of sort of other story happening around the exhibition in terms of how objects from certain places can travel and art, artworks cannot, and how they're kind of moved in different networks. If you go to the next slide, this is an image of Theo Mercier's work, Massacre. Theo is based between Paris and Mexico City. And he plays a lot, again, with the kind of musicological display and the idea of value description and how objects enter the value chain. So he works a lot with, he blends sort of like real artifacts with objects produced for the tourist market. And in this particular work, he's brought together different masks produced in West Africa for the European market. But these were the kind of objects, essentially, they were broken or they were infected. and he's kind of brought them together in kind of museological vitrine. And on the one hand, for him, it kind of echoes the relationship of Europe to kind of its borders, particularly with Africa and African migration, and the extension of the European border extraterritorially. On the other side, it's about the kind of essentially violence that happens in many places, and the histories that are seldom written about or seldom told. And I think Naomi touched on this when she was talking about, this act of writing labels or thinking about how um, to bring these histories into focus around these objects that are most of the time also held in kind of museum store spaces. If you go down, that's a closer look at the tree. The next work is An Extraordinary Event, and this is part of our collection. This is a work of Akram Zakari's, perhaps many of his work. It's really concerned with kind of thinking about the photographic object and how history is written through archives and kind of complicating the reading of history. So here he's brought together the series of found photographs that document the only documentation of the excavation of these sarcophagi from the south of Lebanon in the 1800s in Ottoman rule. And swiftly dispatched to so they were kind of taken to the next museum. If you go to the next slide, you can see more details of the work. So he's produced these kind of ghostly, ghostly images of the sarcophagi being excavated to kind of think about again what histories get left behind, what gets left behind when objects are extracted. If you go down to the next slide, please. So this is a work by Khalil Rabah, and this is also in the collection. This is a painting. It's untitled All Is Well, and it kind of talks about the history of a very important painting in the kind of Palestinian consciousness. On the upper left hand of the painting, there's a very famous painting by Sleiman Mansour called Jamar al-Muhammad, and it depicts an older man carrying Jerusalem on his back. And within this painting, you're producing the work, and Jerusalem kind of slowly disappears and reappears, and the painting sort of changes more. And the history of the painting itself is quite interesting. It became this kind of symbol of loss, particularly in relation to Jerusalem, and it was replicated as posters and hung in sort of schools, offices, and houses across the country. And in the 80s, it was bought by Muammar al-Gaddafi and taken to Libya and was destroyed during American air raid there. So the original was kind of lost, but it lived on in the psyche of many people through the copy. If you scroll down, you can see more details. This is Rayan. This is large-scale work by Rayan Tabit, orthostates, and it's a series of 32 charcoal rubbings of these orthostates, or kind of like tablets that were adorning some of the temple, that were discovered in Al Halaf in Syria were excavated by a German archaeologist during the period between the two world wars. And Rayan became interested in this, in the history of these objects. He discovered that his grandfather had served as kind of private secretary of this archaeologist. He was hired by the French to kind of find this German archaeologist in Syria. So he became kind of interested in it in that way and was able to access a lot of museum collections, bringing these kind of personal documents of his grandfather. And of course, museums having these works in their collection were very interested in hearing about this kind of side story. That's how he was able to kind of access a lot of orthostates and rubbings. The story of the works they were sort of like extracted from the site by Max von Oppenheim and taken, many of them were taken to Berlin, where they were destroyed in Allied air raids. And another portion of them were seized on ships by British and American troops as alien property. So under the Enemy Alien Property Act, they were taken into custody and eventually auctioned off and entered the collection of various museums across Europe, including the Louvre and the Met in the US, and the British Museum and the V&A. So he was really interested in these kind of legal loopholes at certain times in history that allow objects to kind of enter into these collections essentially in a legal way, right? So it was essentially loosing the loop, if you like. And so he's managed to take dubbings of 32 of the 33 remaining Ortho states out of 194, as many were destroyed in Berlin and many were lost. Last one, unfortunately, is at the British Museum, and I think now that they know the kind of premise of the project, it's difficult for him to get access to that collection. If you scroll down, you can see some more views. So here you also have the work of Jumana Manna. And she's a Palestinian artist. Her work is also concerned with the archaeology as a kind of theater of myth production. In this particular work, this was commissioned as part of the 2016 Marrakesh Biennial, and it was in response to the kind of destroyed remains of a destroyed palace in Morocco, El Badia Palace. And she imagines this kind of contractor who's hired in the future to reproduce the interiors of this palace and what he would kind of imagine them be. And the works are kind of very, the scale of the works are very much in relation to the body. And the one on the left is called Amulet, the one on the right is called Shoulder. One of them is made out of bone and the other one is made out of plaster. So they have this kind of immaterial quality about them. And so here it's just thinking about this idea of, how imagination plays a role in kind of reinterpreting the history of these spaces and the history of these objects. You'll see some more exhibition views as you scroll. This is a kind of, if you scroll down, you have a kind of another room view here. And scroll down one more. So this is the work of Randa Abdul Jabbar here, and I've just included a picture of her just to give you a sense of scale. She's an artist and architect based in Abu Dhabi. For a long time, she's been researching the history of her family's town in Iraq, town of Ana, which was flooded in the 80s as part of a large-scale damming project in Iraq. And what made this town what was the focal point of this town was the 16th century minaret. That was the kind of pride and joy of the townspeople. And so they moved it to the location of the new town when the town was flooded. And it was destroyed following the American invasion, and it was destroyed again after it was rebuilt by the community by ISIS a few years later. So it became a stand-in for the town's kind of like trials and tribulations and attempts to kind of rebuild. So she worked with archaeologists there on the ground to recast the windows of the minaret based on some original molds that were produced for the initial reconstruction. And on it, she's projected these home movies that she's found from the townspeople of Ana that document the flooding of the town, but that also show you the kind of minaret and what it meant to people. So I've included a short video as well, just to give you an idea. So if you can play the video, please. على القلعة على القلعة تعال زين علينا بقوية تعال وأزرع تعال يا متعال خلاص شوف الشط شلون صاعد مي عالي يا بي يا بي يا بي يا ويلي. That video Can you hear me? Yeah. That video is of a father kind of singing an ode to the town and taking his children around the town as it's flooding. And there's other videos where she shows the kind of town it's speeded upon flooding. And so these kind of casts just become activated in the space with these voices of the past and these videos of the past town. If you scroll down further, so this is another kind of view of the room with the work of Pio Abad on the right-hand side. And on the next slide, you'll see a more concise view. So this is an ongoing project of Pio's called the Collection of Jane, Ryan, and William Saunders. And for the last few years, he's been making visible this kind of vast trove of loot acquired by the Marcoses during their dictatorship as a way to kind of start talking about this history in the Philippines of the dictatorship that's now being repressed by the current government. So he sort of remakes different facets of the collection, which included kind of old master paintings, jewelry, clothing. I mean, Imelda was most famous. There was sort of a much more insidious side to her. So here he was along with his wife, who's a jewelry designer. This collection of jewelry that was seized Marcoses in Hawaii when they were seeking asylum there. And these pieces were turned over to the Philippine government at the time, which was tasked with kind of valuing them and then selling them at auction to recoup the money. So if you scroll down further, you'll have more views of the work. And so the commission came up with these amazing numbers for each piece of jewelry. For example, one necklace was kind of a percentage of value of the budget for the reconstruction of the metro, X number of school books, or like 15,000 homes for homeless people. So they really valued it in terms of what was taken from the Filipino people in a way. And through this project, he kind of seeks to have these objects kind of act as these talking points, more of the details of the images. And it took them 2 years of kind of laborious work to produce very detailed 3D replicas of the work just from photographs. So they're quite amazing in person. Have some more, please. And some more. Can you scroll down? Okay. So this is Théo Mercier's work again in the exhibition, and this is called Venus à l'œuf. So he's playing with the kind of the idea of the Venus as this quintessential ideal of Western beauty. And again, he's mixing up some artifacts with items produced for the tourist market. And here you have these kind of heavy jugs resting on cartons of eggs. So it's very kind of playful as well. And a lot of his work has that very kind of tongue-in-cheek playfulness too. If you can scroll down, I'm just going to kind of run through the rest. Yeah, I got that. Thank you. This is Ali Shirli's work here, which was commissioned for the show, along with Ren's work. And here he also collects kind of like discarded artifacts or things that have been damaged or ruined on sort of different markets and webs produced. So if you could go to the decolonizing architecture space. Further down, yeah. So decolonizing architecture are an architecture collective who work in and about Palestine. And for this exhibition, it brought together the culmination of a longer-term project called Refugee Heritage, where they're seeking to inscribe the Dheisheh refugee camp in Palestine on the UNESCO World Heritage List. And they're seeking to kind of mobilize the administration of heritage as a political tool, to think about the refugee camp as a kind of permanent temporary space, and to think of it as having its own kind of architectural history, its own kind of spatial culture, and to think about what it would mean to kind of mobilize heritage, to think about how we might describe kind of more temporary spaces on our heritage list. And most of the heritage sites, in fact, that are inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List are mostly in North America and the US. So if you go down, you'll see the kind of real work of the show, which is this dossier they produced, which brings together kind of photographs, architectural drawings and research, and kind of interviews of camp residents and mapping of the camp and the villages that relate to it into one dossier, with the aim of presenting this to UNESCO to kind of engender this discussion. There's a quick video, you can just play it as well, which introduces the project. I don't think the sound is working, is it? Okay.
Do refugee
It's all right, we can skip the video. It's not working.
This was the fundamental question at the base of the nomination of the Dheisheh refugee camp as UNESCO World Heritage Site. Refugee camps are established with the intention of being demolished. They are not accepted to have a history or a future. They are meant to be forgotten. The history of refugee camps is constantly erased, dismissed by states, humanitarian organizations, international agencies, and even by refugee community themselves, in fear that any acknowledgement of the present undermines their right of return. The only history, in fact, that is recognized within refugee communities is one of violence, suffering, and humiliation. How then we understand the life and the culture that people built in camps, despite suffering and marginalization?
If you go on to the next slide. So this is the penultimate work in the show. It's a video by Nora Razian called Reflecting Memory. That was produced some time ago, and the video follows the same time and follows kind of neurosurgeons, psychologists, political historians, political scientists to think about collective trauma and what it means to kind of heal after collective trauma. So essentially, the phantom limb is kind of thought about as this larger metaphor for a traumatized society, like a post-colonial society or otherwise. And it kind of goes with a lot of Khadja's work in thinking about repair as well and restitution. So this was a very important work for me in thinking of the show as well. We won't play the video. I'll take you to the last work in the show. So this is the last work in the show by Forensic Architecture. It's a large-scale installation called Maps of Defiance. And this was a work that we co-produced with the V&A for the London Design Biennial. And the installation follows the destruction of Yazidi shrines in Iraq and maps these against a larger case for genocide of the Yazidi people by ISIS in 2014. So part of the installation kind of maps the cultural significance of these shrines and shows them in kind of everyday use. On the other hand, it talks about the violence perpetrated by ISIS, and then finally it looks at the kind of technologies used to kind of do photogrammetry and 3D modeling to, on the one hand, archive these shrines for the future, to kind of archive what they were and where they were, and for these models to be used as a basis for reconstruction if so desired. And part of the work is producing this kind of DIY kit for communities to enable them to build their own kind of drone cameras to enable quick capturing of destruction as it happens. And so it's comprised of a lot of research, 3D models that were printed, and a short video that you can kind of play a very short snippet of if we have time. It's on the last slide.
By overlaying our contemporary drone images over a satellite image from 2013, a year before the destruction, we can correctly orient and begin examination of the Ahmadiyyan shrine. We can intact mausoleum, the adjacent shrine, and to their south, sacred stone construction known as Kevir, where wicks were burned as part of ceremony. Closely studying the high-resolution drone image of the Ahmadiyyan shrine, we can identify small fractions of the fragmented spire. The remains of the steel-reinforced roof of the temple were blown several meters away by the blast. The outline of the concrete bases on which the renovated temple stood can be identified. Most mausoleums were recorded are based on a shared, simple, architectural plan comprising 2 square rooms, a public front area, and an inner room where the remains of the sheikh or saint are buried.
Yazidi shrines are not only places of burial that hold geographic, architectural, or material importance, but they are crucial in the construction and maintaining of Yazidi collective memory.
Thank you. Yeah. Actually, was that the end of the question? Hello? Can you hear me? Okay. I'm just going to keep my video off because it's making the connection a little slower. So to answer your question, I definitely think there's been much more space created in these institutions late. And I think here we're talking predominantly about sort of like North American or European encyclopedic museums, right? For example, Rayan Thabit's work was shown this summer at the Louvre within an exhibition that was a kind of historical exhibition of this Hittite excavation. There, unfortunately, it felt quite gestural as it sat kind of outside of the space. And when you went into the exhibition, the captions really did not sort of address the history of the object and articulation at all. So in some senses, it can feel quite tokenistic. He just showed it right now at the Met, who also own part of the Ortho States collection. I don't know how it's presented there. I haven't seen installation. I feel like there was a much more in-depth discussion with the kind of collecting practices and history of that institution, and having the works there kind of enabled this more public discussion. So I feel like there is a little bit more space, also in terms of curators that are coming in to work on these historic collections. More and more interested doing kind of trans-historic shows and bringing objects into dialogue with more contemporary practices also opens up a lot. So I think in that sense, I think we'll see a lot more. At the same time, these objects are very, at the heart of the kind of economic model of many of these museums. So I think the discussion on restitution right now has evolved around sort of producing these copies, these like very detailed printed copies of works that can be that can be given back, or to have these kind of long-term loans, which doesn't really address the history at all. So I think there's a lot more work to be done in kind of lobbying these institutions and the public, kind of asking for more transparency into the collecting practices, more transparency into the kind of provenance of these works. So I think it will happen. I think it's just a very slow process. On the other hand, you have a lot more kind of institutions that are coming up that are demanding, the return of these objects, because part of the excuse was that there were no institutions that were able to actually serve them. That's also very much changing on the ground. So I think that will be a key player as well in these discussions.
Thanks. Can you also elaborate a little bit more on the way that Art Jamil is also growing its collection in terms of, and the ways in which these sort of research-based initiatives like the studio residency, etc., are also happening there, because in a way it is opening up also the model between, say, a museum versus an art center. It's doing a lot of different things. It's playing multiple roles, really, and yet it's also very conscious about its location at the Dubai Creek. So if you could elaborate a little bit more on how you're also navigating the different roles that the institution is playing, that would be great.
Yeah, I mean, we're a very new institution, so we're able to kind of play with those different models and if you want, mix things up a little bit more easily, sort of conscious of the baggage that exists around museum models or center models, and try and shake things up a little bit. The location on the creek is a way for us to think about these ideas of confluence, or how ideas kind of travel and migrate, particularly around shared bodies of water. And so we're very interested in kind of thinking out. Dubai is a very, in a way, it's a kind of very urban city. We want to think about the geographies that are present here. That's really thinking about South Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East, of course, but you really feel like those three places are very much present here in Dubai. So that's kind of opened up our thinking around the collection and around the relevance of the collection to a local population here. A lot of our collection comes out of our commissioning program, not just for exhibitions, but more broadly. So part of the mission of the through commissioning large-scale works, where opportunities might not exist for that. And that's particularly true in the region where many arts institutions have very little funding to commission large-scale work. And so we really felt like this was a priority for us as well. So that's very much one of the ways that works into our collection and the way we like to work with art. Research is also very much at the core of what we do. I mean, we have a library, the first art resource library in the UAE, and it produces its own kind of public programs. It invites practitioners to showcase their ongoing research visually in the space. It's a very active producer of content. At the same time, we're collecting, we're archiving, and the way we collect books is really through crowdsourcing, through our programming. So again, not trying to produce a single sort of like reading or an art historical reading. In a way, we're kind of freed of that impetus to sort of work in art historical ways. We can really sort of respond to what's happening at the moment around us. Enables much more flexibility, much more excitement in terms of our collective practices.
Hi, Nora, it's Lydia. A quick question, or maybe not a quick question. One of the institutions in your region that's building and retelling the story in the Gulf and more broadly in the Middle East is the Louvre Abu Dhabi, which is building an incredible collection of artifacts of the type that you've talked about from previous generations. But it also has quite a problematic history in that the new Jean Nouvel building was built on a forced migration of laborers who, have been kept there for years and maybe creating a new sort of trauma. I wonder if there's any space to talk about this in the context of working in the Gulf.
I think there's much more space to talk about this. I think it's obviously different in every city in the Emirates, but I think there's much more space to talk about this now. These kind of bigger institutions are more aware of best practice in terms of labor rights and fair labor practices. So obviously, on a larger public level, it's still very difficult. You had labor who are quite active. A lot of their members are banned from entering the country at the moment. So on a local level, it's still difficult. I think on a general public level, there's a lot more awareness about these issues, definitely. And in terms of how things are moving forward, there's a lot of change that has happened.
Nora, there was a question on forensic architecture which might be taken with you offline because the voice isn't so clear right now.
Okay, no worries.
So much, Nora, and also like for everybody else, that there are these short interviews that Mira has been doing with the curators, and I'm sure Nora will be happy to also answer more questions later. And if you want to reach her, so please do feel free to do that through us as well. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.